Greetings, and welcome to Theology Thursdays. We continue our study in N.T. Wright's book, Surprised by Hope. We've talked about the last couple of chapters as to the worldview that we take on when we are looking at the acts of Jesus, but also what those acts of Jesus are meaning for not just us personally, but rather for the cosmos as a whole, the whole universe. Taking a universe approach first, down to the personal. We're still in the midst of looking at the wider scope of what is going on, but N.T. Wright is going to bring in another story and another central point about the work of Christ. And it actually has to do with what is our concept of Jesus' continuing presence. Now, this is something that perhaps we have a vague idea of, that Jesus is present with those who are gathered together, that Jesus is around, so to speak, but in what way, shape, or form, maybe we are not entirely clear on that. But asking how Jesus is still around is actually a really important question, because it gets down to, once again, what exactly is Jesus up to, so to speak? So we've talked the past couple of chapters about what is a biblical, more tightly biblical worldview as to how to understand the world in the lenses, as we talked about last week, of creation, of the nature of evil, and of redemption. But now we have to ask ourselves, what is the role of Christ within that redemptive story? And most specifically, how is Christ's role in that cosmic redemptive story working itself out? And to ask that question, we have to deal with the question of, what does it mean for Jesus to be present? Or, to use the opposite end of that spectrum, what does it mean for the fact that we don't see Jesus? Or that we believe that Jesus is present, but also, in a way, not present? Well, that asks the very question of the mystery of the ascension of Jesus. The ascension that is described within the Gospels is when Christ ascended back into heaven to his Father. However, that is counterbalanced by the fact that Christ very clearly said that the Spirit will be given to those, and that Jesus continuously speaks through the Spirit, and that we have in the book of Hebrews that Christ ministers as high priest in the heavenly realms. What are we to do with that as it comes to how we understand the world working? Well, to get at this in, again, another worldview question, that is to deal with the very nature of what is going on when Jesus ascends. Two particular points of view about this are going to be discussed. The ascension, as Wright points out, tends to fall along two lines. The line of the ascension, such is that in the Gospels of the interpretation of Jesus taking off in a vertical pattern, so to speak, into the heavenly realms, into outer space, basically. The other being that to talk about Jesus as being ascended to heaven is simply to talk about what happens to Jesus' spirit after he died. In other words, collapsing the ascension into the crucifixion. The resurrection being identified with the ascension. So that when we talk about resurrection or talk about ascension, we're merely talking about the soul of Christ going off to the heavenly realms where it's supposed to go. Now, if you see me using that language, you'll know that Wright is wanting to highlight how pervasive both of these ideas might be in two different places within the theological spectrum. One of them is sort of reserved for more of the literal interpretation of the ascension, that Jesus goes up in this pattern looking, and we have this in the disciples looking up into the clouds, right? And the angels that talk with the disciples at the beginning of the book of Acts saying, why are you staring up into heaven? He will send the Spirit like he said he was going to, and telling them to, go and wait like they're supposed to. But this idea of almost like Jesus as rocket ship taking off into space, if that makes sense, which in the literal sense is what we see within the testimony of the Gospels. But again, the literal sense is also getting at the mystery of the ascension. What exactly is Jesus doing in this? And what really is going on? That's a more nuanced question. But also, on the other side, collapsing the ascension into the resurrection as if they're one thing is more of, as Wright points out, more of sort of the liberal interpretation of the way that resurrection happens, more of a rationalist interpretation. And unfortunately, what happens when we collapse these two things together, we can get confused in some very fundamental ways. And those ways that he will point out when we talk about the second coming here in just a couple of minutes. But what he wants to highlight is that these are the two tensions that we find ourselves in the midst of when we talk about what exactly the ascension is. Rather, when we start thinking cosmically about what the ascension of Jesus means to the cosmos, we then have to ask some very different questions. We're no longer asking, where in space did Jesus go? Did Jesus blast off to Mars or something like that? Which, of course, seems like a silly thing to say, but we have some perhaps rightly nuanced versions and visions as to what the ascension means as a mystery. In the same way that we have the mystery of the resurrection, we have the mystery of the ascension. But rather, the mystery of the ascension does play a really distinct and important role apart from the mystery of the resurrection. And it has to do with the fact that Jesus has, in a sense, taken charge of the way that things are going on. In a very real way, we have attestations in various parts of the Bible of Christ in his ascension is now seated at the right hand of God. The imagery that you're supposed to have in this is that Jesus has taken his place of authority. And even Jesus himself saying, after his resurrection, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. And that this authority is that authority that Jesus now sends the disciples in. And also with the promise, if you remember, that Jesus will be with them always, even to the end of the age. And then we have the ascension. Well, if Jesus is with them until the end of the age, but Jesus leaves, what exactly is that meant to do? Well, think about the Gospel of John. If he does not ascend, the Spirit will not come. But also, he ascends to fill all things. There is a fulfillment language being used here. A language that Jesus is taking the reins of what is going on in the world. And in that sort of sense, we have a real particular idea that the redemption of the world is still being worked out actively by Christ, but not in the same sort of present fashion that we would have, let's say, face to face, but rather it is in a different sort of relationship. And the way that Wright wants to caution us from too overly reliant on a literal sort of thing of Jesus blasting off into space is that our understanding of space and time has to also provide the cultivation of thinking of heaven as a different dimensional reality, rather than merely a different locative space. Instead, what it is Jesus operates within the world in a different kind of relationship to it based upon the reality of heaven, or the dimension of heaven, to say. And this is what Wright is getting at. Thinking of heaven not as a heaven up there, earth right here, and hell is down there, as if in a directional reality, but rather as dimensions, layers of reality. He gives the example, when we talk about someone being promoted at their job, that they are moving up, we don't think that they're actually physically moving to a higher floor or moving up the stairs, so to speak, but rather we use that in a metaphorical sense, that someone is ascending a ladder of employment, that someone is taking on higher responsibility. But we don't mean that someone is taking responsibility at a different elevation. We say that someone is taking on a different level of responsibility in the sense that it is a different qualitative level rather than a different quantitative level, as if one is quantitatively at a higher floor or not. The same sort of metaphor Wright wants to suggest is the way that we have to understand the ascension. That Jesus ascends not merely in this locative sense, but in this cosmic sense, in this dimensional sense. That Christ ascends the plane of existence in a very real way. And that this ascension to this different plane of existence does not merely mean that Jesus is not here, but rather Jesus is here in a different fashion than before. And so we get into this different sort of metaphor that we have to deal with that pushes back against some of these other ways that we can view the ascension. But the other essential part of this discussion of Jesus ascending is the very important fact that Jesus ascends bodily. This is no small thing to pass over. Jesus, who is bodily in his resurrection, bodily ascends as well. There is not a bifurcation between the physical and the spiritual. Again, this is something that Wright is going to harp on over and over again. But rather, in the relationship of the ascension, it is not merely that, perhaps as is popularly sometimes said, that Jesus, who was God, becomes human for a little bit and then goes back to being God. But rather, as the church has said, no, God is fully Christ. Christ is fully God. But Christ is also fully human. 100%, 100%, not 50-50. And in this sense, Jesus, who is fully divine, ascends bodily, because Jesus is fully human, back to the heavenly realms. And in that very same way, takes his full humanness with him. Now, this is really important because it shows in a very demonstrable fashion that the real reality, the real hope of reality, is that physical reality is caught up into this bigger dimensional existence that is no longer separated from each other, but rather is married together. This bodily and physical, along with the spiritual existence, both of these together, just like we say that we are not merely physical and not merely souls in transit, but we are both of these things. Instead, the ascension is the sign of the reconnection between that dimensional reality of heaven and the dimensional reality of earth. And so when we talk about this mystery of the ascension, what we're talking about is Jesus' redemption reaches beyond our conception of mere time and space, but reaches to a different dimensional reality within the universe. And that Christ is both present in a new way, but also, again, absent in a particular way. What are we to do with that sort of liminal space that we're in, that Jesus is both present in a way but also not? That we're both fully promised that we have the Holy Spirit living within us, the baptized, that Christ has sent to us, that Christ continues to speak to us as we fully believe he does, and yet we also believe that there will be a second coming. But before we get to the second coming, we have to deal with the ramifications of the Ascension. Remember that if we collapse the Ascension into the resurrection, we run into some problems. And one of those problems is that when we collapse the Ascension and the resurrection into one thing, as if the Spirit of Christ simply goes to the heavenly realms so that Christ can then fill all of those for whom Christ fills in the world, we then run into a temptation to treat Christ or to replace Christ's reign in the heavenly realm with a stand-in. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, if we take the presence of Christ in too far of a practical direction, such as in perhaps a popular quip, Christ is in this person in front of me, while that might be true in one sense, it also can be the temptation to too closely identify Christ's presence not with this dimensional reality, but with rather a stand-in. And this is a deep temptation that we can put as it comes to the church. Over the millennia, those who are bearers of the cross of Christ, bearers of the name Christian, in enacting the presence of Christ, which we believe is present within us, one of the things that we can be tempted to do is identify Christ with the church. How often have you heard it said, or at least said in passing, well, how can I believe in Jesus if the church looks like this? That, Wright says, is a mistake, because we identify Christ too closely with those who are redeemed by Christ. We identify Christ too closely with those who still sin and mess up and are part of a broken world. And when we too closely identify Jesus with the church, especially what we would refer to as the institutional church, we can very easily be confused by the fact that, well, if the church is supposed to have Jesus' presence, why is the church not perfect? Or why, to use the popular example, why is the church full of hypocrites? As if that's, for some reason, confusing. But if you have that collapsed mentality of the ascension and the resurrection being one thing, and therefore the Spirit of Christ is upon all people, you run into the very real question of, why are things not better? Why do the people who say that they are bearers of Jesus still completely screw up, completely mess up in big, substantial ways? Or to use a more kind of qualitative example, why is the church not fully good? And again, using the word "the church" is one of those key phrases that shows that we are identifying too closely Jesus as identified with church rather than Jesus as Savior of the church. And so there's a distinction between these things that we have to be very careful not to collapse into themselves, because when we do that, we get all sorts of problems and we get all sorts of confusion. And perhaps because we're not clear about that distinction is the reason why we get confused in that. To actually use a current day apologist, the Reverend Tim Keller, who is a Presbyterian minister for many years, who was a church planter in New York. Tim Keller said, very interestingly, when we remove ourselves from being so closely identified with Christ's goodness, we recognize the goodness of Christ even more. We actually, when we look at the incomprehensible brokenness that we have within our very selves, even in our best intentions, we then recognize the utter grace of God in the way that God interacts with the world. Now, this is, Wright would suggest, a proper understanding of the Ascension, because what the Ascension does not do is make it so that Jesus equals the church. No, the church is the body, Jesus the head. Jesus is distinct from and involved with but on a different dimensional relationship to the church. And we have to be clear about that because we have to also talk about the fact that Jesus is coming back again. When we talk about the second coming, most people will probably have one thing pop into their head, which is the popular series Left Behind. Now, this is probably a generational sort of relationship, but the particular understanding of the second coming of Christ, we are in the milieu of the past 200 years. And in the past 200 years, we have had a very interesting movement in theology that is referred to as dispensationalism. Dispensationalism is, at least in general terms, the belief that we are at this moment in the end times right now. That there are things that are signs of the end of times that we are having to pay attention to that are found, at least popularly, within the book of the Revelation to John. And this has been really popularized by the Left Behind book series. But that Left Behind book series doesn't come from nowhere. That comes from many, many, many years of this being in the popular theological imagination. But this makes it difficult to talk about the second coming in a couple of senses. Because when we talk about the second coming, if the first thing that comes to your mind is the rapture, one of the issues that we have with that is that it is perhaps the worst case scenario when we're talking about the second coming. Real Christians have already left. And those in the Left Behind series are not those who were redeemed, but they are left to sort of scrape together as some sort of existence. The thing is that this catching away of believers out of the world is that sort of temptation we get into, again, through Platonic philosophy. That believers are caught away so that they don't have to experience the pain of the physical world. But also this has another practical aspect, which is if we believe that we are in the end times, that the apocalypse is right around the corner, this also leads into practical issues. Why care about pollution in the earth if the world is just going to be burned up here in just a short matter of time anyway? Why should we care about the melting of the polar ice caps and the rising of ocean levels if the world is going to end here in just a little bit anyway? Well, Wright wants to point out that these can have extremely close relationships between geopolitical issues. That, in other words, the theology behind dispensationalism may be a tad bit identified with certain geopolitical leanings rather than actual theological bearings. In other words, it is an accommodation between the theological things that we can sort of massage to fit what our geopolitical leanings are, whether that be industrialism or other things. And what that does, though, is that removes our urgency to perform justice right now. Think about the sentiment of, well, things are just going to be burned up, taken care of anyway, so what we have to focus on is the individual soul. Well, except that that's not really what the Bible does. The escapism sort of aspect was really not what Paul was getting at when he talks about us being citizens of heaven. Citizenship in heaven really is a part of the earth, a part of the cosmos of which we're in. And the vision of what the second coming is going to do is, as we've talked about over and over again, marriage of heaven and earth. Not the destruction, but rather the renewing of creation, the making of things new through Christ's second coming. But we also have a little bit of a temptation towards the other side of this when we start talking about the second coming, which is that, at least within 18th century theology, there is a lessening of, or at least a lessening of the focus on the second coming at all. And particularly within Anglican circles and Roman Catholic circles and things like that, when we are partakers of the Blessed Sacrament of the Holy Communion, which we say Christ is fully present in, we perhaps have the question of, well, if Christ is present with us always whenever we partake of the sacrament, why do I have to worry about the second coming? Or why do I have to care about the second coming? Well, it's not that Jesus is not present in that way. Again, we're talking about different dimensional realities, right? If we take Wright's word at this, we are different dimensional reality of heaven and earth. But the second coming, however, being moved to second place, so to speak, is also to discount this whole idea that there will be a judgment of the world, that there will be a setting aright of the world, and rather that through progress in that right direction that we will achieve that. Again, watch a couple of chapters ago to talk about the myth of progress. Because too close a reliance on that progress model discounts two of the things that perhaps we would rather not have to deal with, which is the coming of Christ in glory and the judgment of the world. Those two finalities of Jesus's parousia into the world are or to be put into maybe starker cases, the ultimate victory of Christ in the world in a real fashion, not simply a spiritual fashion, but in an embodied fashion. Those are uncomfortable aspects of the more sort of progress model. Because what that means is there will be a reckoning. Something that the more dispensationalist side of the spectrum will be more comfortable with. But at the same time, that reckoning might take a different form than just dispensational theology. That is really closely tied to geopolitical things. But rather, there is a reality to both. The fact that Jesus is present in some sort of way, but also will be made fully manifest in a bodily way. That these two things are not separate from each other, but rather they're part of the whole of eschatology, the theology of the end, what the end is going to look like. But when it comes to thinking about the end, what we have to think about is what we really mean by judgment. As one beloved theology professor of mine once said, we actually, if we think about it, long for the judgment of God. That judgment is not this idea of judgmentalism, but rather judgment in its very word is the setting aright of the scales. It is the setting things back balanced. And as Wright points out, when we are tempted too closely to the moralistic side of you should do better, or we need to enact ways of being able to, through judicial systems and through social systems, enact equality in these things. That itself is part and parcel of a larger judgmentalism, if it is too closely aligned with the moralistic side. Not that any of these things are bad, but they are not the end. They are not what the goal of the second coming of Christ is. As Wright would say, we have done our part within the wider sort of Western liberalism of making judgments and setting social programs and things like that. And yet, the more that we do that, the more that we find those very things wanting. To use his exact words, we have judged the child abusers, and we have found that very idea of system wanting. We have judged the ills of those who would perpetrate violence against ecology, and yet we have found those very systems to be wanting. But rather, what proper judgment brings about is what we find in the Psalms. That at the judgment of God, you have an incredible sigh of relief from the cosmos. You have the trees and the birds and the rivers clapping their hands with joy that things have been judged and made aright. There is, to use another example, a restorative aspect of judgment. Judgment is not merely passing sentence. It is restoring something. And insofar as we only see judgment as passing sentence, we have forgotten what the biblical roots of judgment really is, which is that it is all made aright as it should have been in the first place. That's what the judgment of God is. It's not this judge sitting with a gavel getting ready to sentence someone to jail, or worse. It rather is the judgment that is involved in the setting aright the scales themselves. To even continue to use the metaphor of the judicial system, there is a difference between judgment sentencing and rehabilitation. What God is about a holistic judgment that rehabilitates the rest of the world, and that ultimate rehabilitation comes in the bodily manifestation of Christ's second coming. And in that ultimate setting aright of the judgment of the world, we also are given something that is important to understand about the trajectory of that judgment. The past couple of chapters, I've used the word teleology. Teleology simply means goal-orientedness, but to put it in a picture, an acorn is never meant to only just be an acorn. An acorn has a teleology to it. It is meant to fall, sprout, and grow a tree. And that tree is meant to grow leaves, to flourish, to grow big and strong, so that the birds can make their nests. And in the transience of the world, when that tree is cut down for lumber or falls down, becomes the home for more of creation. And that produces more acorns that have a orientedness towards a goal. In the same way that we talk about that acorn forming into a tree so that we can see not only the functionality, but also the beauty of the trees, the natural things of the world that are signs of how the world should be. Our teleology about the second coming is part of that same mystery. We have a goal-orientedness that we are working in the world actively as the body of Christ towards that perfect justice. However, we also recognize we will not make it just. We cannot set the world aright. But rather that teleology is a trajectory towards which culminates in the second coming of Christ. And that is what we'll talk about next week.